207. And then before the lesson, we'll sing 234. 234. Let's stand as we sing, please. I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I onward bound. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's table land, a higher plane that I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. My heart has no desire to stay where doubts arise and fears dismay, though some may dwell where these abound. My prayer, my aim is higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's table land, a higher plane that I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. I want to scale the utmost height and catch a gleam of glory bright, but still I'll pray till heaven I found. Lord, lead me on to higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's table land, a higher plane that I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Be seated.
We're going to be looking tonight at Psalm 46. And if you'd like to put your finger there, and we'll be reading that in just a moment. I want to know, is there anyone in here who's never had anxiety or fear? None? Okay, then I can relax and feel at home. Because that is a common thing we have to deal with in life. We know that Jesus said, "Let not your hearts be troubled." And he said, "My peace I live with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid." There are over 100 passages in which God tells us in the Bible not to fear. Don't be afraid. Now, there are not that many passages that tell us about the Lord's Supper or baptism. Sometimes, in our preaching, we kind of get imbalanced. It's so easy for us to think that one thing is more important than others, and so that's kind of all we talk about. Doctrine is extremely important, and we need to ground everybody in doctrine. That's the foundation of who we are. But that's not all of it. So much of the Bible is about practical living. And when the Apostle Paul said to the Ephesian elders, "I was with you," while I was with you, I did not shrink back from declaring to you the whole counsel of God. That whole counsel of God has to do with how we live. how we live in relationships with other people, how we deal with our own spiritual lives, and how we deal with our emotional needs. Now, I don't find any justification in Scripture for misbehavior based on having a bad background. You want to talk about a bad background? You go through the Bible and look at some of those people that, had bad backgrounds. And yet, God expected them to do the right thing. And yet we have so many people in our world today who will justify themselves because somebody else did something to mistreat them or whatever it is. Yeah. Well, that's not okay. Nearly everybody in here knows that I have a double life so far as my work is concerned. I see it as one, because I see my mission when I'm in my office working with people who have emotional problems as being a significant part of doing God's work. Most of the people that come to see me are not Christians, as we know Christians. And some of them don't even believe in God. Some may be Muslims. I have just about everything out there who would come and see me, and all kinds of backgrounds. And there are all kinds of issues. Some of them are relationship issues, some of them are marital, some of them are problems with kids. But of all the basic emotional issues that I think I deal with, anxiety is one of the most frequent. And this passage has a lot to say about how we deal with anxiety. And anxiety can really plague us spiritually. And sometimes it cripples us. And lots of people deal with what we refer to as toxic guilt because they do have anxiety. They think that because I'm anxious or I have panic attacks, that I'm not a good Christian. And I'm going to tell you that a lot of preachers have reinforced that idea. I've heard many people, and I've heard messages that says that if you really trust God, you will never be depressed. That's kind of like saying if you really trust God, you'll never have a heart attack. You know, your brain's an organ. It is a vital organ in your body. And the brain can get sick just like the heart can get sick. Now, we need to differentiate between the physical and the emotional or situational or environmentally produced stressors. And for 20 years in medical practice, and I think most of our members know that I resigned and left the medical practice about 4 years ago when they sold the clinic to the hospital, and I didn't want to work with the arrangement the hospital wanted. But my role was to differentiate between what was physical and what was psychological. And always in my mind, there's the question of, is there also a spiritual component here that needs to be looked at? And the way I'm able to work with Christians is very different from the way I can work with a non-believer. You and I have resources available to us that haven't been promised to the non-believer. And we need to access those. we need to understand that God has a lot to say about how we deal with those emotional issues. And we need to know the difference. And I never try to make people feel guilty about being anxious. It doesn't work, number one. There's no therapeutic value in it, and there's a lot of potential for spiritual harm. But I want you to read with me. Let's begin at verse 1. There are 11 verses. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. There is a river whose stream makes glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her right early. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has wrought desolation in the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. This chapter tells us a number of things about anxiety. It tells us, number one, that it's very common, and that some things we fear are very real. Studies have shown that Americans are among the most stressed people on earth. Now, we have not identified why, but I suspect that one of the reasons is we have so much stuff. We have things to worry about. When you don't have anything, you don't worry about it. Some of us remember what it was like, to have basically nothing. And the biggest thing to worry about was whether or not it was going to rain and the crops would produce. Well, in David's day, there were enemies that were constantly bombarding the people of God, and the cities would be surrounded. And it was very common for a city to have a wall built around it. And the enemies would come and threaten those cities and destroy them. So the danger of which the psalmist speaks is real. It's a real danger. It's not imaginary. Now, when people are suffering from anxiety disorders, they're anxious about things that haven't happened, may never happen, and sometimes could never happen. I've had people who were afraid to go outside when it was sunny because they were afraid gravity would quit working, they'd fall off the earth. Intelligent people. People who could turn left but not right. Who could drive 2 miles from home but no farther. Who had to live within 2 or 3 blocks of a hospital. Who were just riddled with fear and anxiety. Who couldn't go into public places. Not even to church. Now, those are treatable. They're treatable with medication. And so we use medication for that. But some of these fears are based in reality. And we ought to fear. We have built inside of us a mechanism in our brain, little thing down here that's behind your ear that looks like a kidney bean. It's called the amygdala. It's that fight or flight trigger. And we talk about fight or flight. Well, I think there's a third one, and that's the tremble. The people who just freeze, they don't know what to do. And I've seen people, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? And they just freeze. Well, fear can actually freeze someone. I had a fellow tell me years ago, came in to see me, he said, I'm fretting about worrying. I thought, that's a good way to put it. I'm worrying about worrying, huh? Okay. But there are things that are real. And it's comforting to me to know what one of our gospel songs says, this world is not our home. This world is not my home. I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. This world is not your home. I don't belong here. Oh, I live here, but my days here are numbered. So are yours. Jesus says, don't worry about what men can do to you. Don't be anxious about that, but fear instead the one who can take your soul and body, cast you into hell. Yeah. That's because this world's not our home. Now, we have so many things that people in Israel's day and Old Testament, they didn't have. We have doctors and hospitals and nurses. We have retirement programs. We have pension plans in some places. And we have food stamps. And we have a government subsidized housing and on and on and on. Yeah, they didn't have that. There was no insurance. There was no retirement program. None of that. They had greater cause for anxiety than we do. That may not be very comforting to us, but when we realize that we brought nothing into the world, we're taking nothing away from it either. So don't latch onto it. Don't think. We realize that Scripture tells us that in heaven God will wipe away all the tears and there'll be no worry, none of that. No death, no crying, no sorrow. I mean, that's an amazing promise, isn't it? That's just amazing. Lady had lost her daughter. She'd been killed. Husband was unfaithful, and she thought she was going to lose her job. And when asked, when the world just crashes in on you, to whom do you go? Where do you go? She said, I just go to myself. And then she said that the one word that described her best was the word alone. This is what David promises us, that you'll never be alone. You don't face anything by yourself. Look at verse 1. God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in trouble. He's here. He's present. Yeah. And that is so comforting. In Deuteronomy 31, verse 6 says, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. The Lord of hosts, the psalmist says in verses 7 and 11, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. I think of an 84-year-old grandmother who lived alone in the old family house. She had children, 4 children who lived in the same town, but they did not live with her. And one night she heard a noise coming from her closet. Next morning she called her son and said, and she didn't normally call them unless there was an emergency. And so one of the sons rushed over. Mom, what's wrong? And she said, well, I heard a noise last night in the closet. He said, well, why didn't you call me last night? She said, well, I didn't want to bother you, so I just nailed the door shut. Well, that's kind of what God does. He's in the business of nailing the door shut. So He's always there, and we never are away from Him at all. He also tells us that He will give us joy and gladness in the morning. Listen to what He says here in verses 4 and 5. He says, there is a river. Now think about that. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. He shall not be moved. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning comes. Wow. Who's this river? The river's God. In those cities I was talking about, when they would surround those cities, in fact, even though they were walled, all they had to do was stay there and wait them out till they ran out of water and they ran out of food. Now, if you have a good, healthy supply of water, you may survive a long time. But those wells, after a while, they're running dry. They may become stale or whatever, but, He says, there's a river. It flows through the city of God. You and I have a constant supply of freshness, refreshing. And that is so wonderful. It's joy. It brings us joy. Now, I love fresh water. On our farm, when I was growing up, right outside, about 10 feet from the back porch, we had a well, a dug well. We didn't have running water till I was about 15 years old. We got running water, no bathroom, but running water. I thought we were uptown, man. That was awesome, see? I didn't miss that because never had it. Some of you were in the same boat. But that water was so good that people heard about it. And they would come from town and want a drink of water out of our well. We called it freestone water. No limestone, no minerals that were so putrid. It was just wonderful water. And if that well were still operational and cleaned out and supplying water to that there on that farm today, that'd be one of the first places I'd want to go when I return down there. Is go get a drink of water. Well, I kind of see that the way God is. And He's constantly telling us that He's there for us. He's a God who is constantly providing us with freshness. Well, then He tells us later on here, he says, verse 10, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still and know that I am God. I know that all of you who have had children, small children, have had to wrestle with your children sometimes when you're trying to put clothes on or you're trying to get a splinter out of their finger. And you'll say, just sit still, sit still. I can't do it when you're moving around. And that's what God is saying to us. Be still. Remember in Exodus chapter 14, the children of Israel came to the Red Sea, and here comes Pharaoh and his army. And they look back and says, "You should have left us in Egypt. It would have been better back there. We could have served the gods of Egypt anyway." And God says, tell them to be still. Be still. And that's worth reading. Let's turn over here if you want to. If you don't want to turn, just listen. Let me find Exodus chapter 14. It comes after Leviticus, doesn't it? And right before Numbers. Listen to exactly what was said. "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again." Your troubles are going to go away. You're not going to see them again. "The Lord will fight for you. The Lord will fight for you. And you have to only be still." Just sit still. Know God's there. Don't fidget. Don't wiggle. Don't do that, because he will take care of things. But the second part of that is, know that I'm God. He's God. I don't know what kind of relationship you had with your dad. I was a tag-along sometimes. But one of the places I did not want to go, but I never told him, was I didn't want to go coon hunting with him. Those dark woods with a kerosene lantern. I stayed really close to Dad. And as long as I was right beside him, I wasn't afraid. I was okay. Now, I can't quite say that. I was kind of afraid that sometimes there might be something coming from the other side. But I was just a child. But it was comforting to know that this is Dad. Dad's not afraid. Why should I be afraid? I want to tell you a story about a woman named Gladys Aylward. She was a missionary to China who oversaw an orphanage for Chinese children. Little more than 100 children in that orphanage. This was in World War II, and the Japanese were pressing, and they were in danger, imminent danger. So she, along with one assistant, took those 100+ children and headed out across the mountains towards safety. Pretty long journey. Food supply was running out. After all, how much can some children take? And you couldn't carry very much. You had to escape. You had to run. And Gladys was, pretty concerned and worrying about how we're going to feed the kids. 14-year-old girl came to her and said, "You know that story about Israel going to the Red Sea and what Moses said and how he did that and parted those waters. And Gladys said to her, "I'm not Moses." And the little girl said, "No, but God is still God." And that's what we need to remember. God is still God. So why should we not fear? Because God is still God. I don't think God expects any of us to never have any, fear. Only a foolish person would never have any fear. Or that person has some kind of disorder of the brain. I have seen children had no fear whatsoever. They would crawl out of a third-story window and fall right to the ground because of physical disorder. There are some things to fear. But God's talking about those kinds of fears that He will take care of. He will take care of. If you see a car careening across the median and coming straight at you, you're going to be afraid. But in the big picture of things, we don't need to worry about the stuff. And the reality is that our worry is usually over things over which we do not have control or things that are unknown. But we serve a God who knows. We serve a God who is in control. Probably what we fear most is when we're told that we have a terminal illness. Never been told that, have you? Well, some of you have. And I've often thought, how would I react? I think I'd react very much like everybody else. I mean, there is the unknown. But then we stop, and through the eye of faith, we see God. We see His promises, and then we relax. I think my mother probably had the least amount of fear of anybody I'd ever seen in my life. When she was facing a major operation, a heart operation that had barely been done, I was 33 years old. And a friend called and asked her if she was ready to go. Can you imagine a call like this? My mama said, "I reckon." She said, do you think that if you were to die, you would go to heaven? Mama said, "I reckon." She said, "Aren't you afraid you might die?" Mama said, "I don't reckon." Well, we're all there around our mama's bed. I mean, all 8 kids, we're all there. And spouses, some were with us, and we're there, and Mama's going in for this operation. And just before she goes under the influence of the drug, she looks at my brother and says, "If I don't come out of this, you need to gather the apples." Because they're ready. And so they go into surgery. It's a long surgery, and tedious surgery. And one of the medical staff came out and said, "Your mom is the calmest person in there." including the doctors and nurses. They hadn't done many of these ever. So, well, that's faith. Mama had a simple faith. She'd go around singing about it. Singing about it. She had the faith of a child. It's as though the father says, jump, and the child jumps. That's the way Mom was. Well, do you find yourself doubting God? Don't feel bad about that. Those fleeting moments, but stop and put on your faith glasses and look again at the promises God made and find the joy that's going to come. Whether it's financial hardships, all of us are only a heartbeat away from death. And it only takes one big tragedy to wipe us out. Take away the years and years and years that we've worked for. But you know what? I think probably everybody in here has worked for something bigger and better, a treasure that's far more than that. And God has provided. That's what he says here. Remember the works that I've done. You look back and you see what God has done. Not only in history of all those biblical persons, but in your own life. I usually tell people that if there's nothing in your life that you can't explain, then maybe you haven't been letting God work in your life. Because when he works inside of us and works through us, there are results. There are results that we cannot understand. So we're going to stop here. Hopefully this passage will be helpful to you as it is to me. And if there's anyone here who's never obeyed the gospel, you need to be baptized in Christ, you can come tonight. Or if there's any other spiritual need that you're facing in your life and you need to respond, we always offer the invitation of the Lord, and you can come as we stand and sing together.
Hark the gentle